Johnson at CK Tricky on X, joined by my co-host Seth Law at Seth Law on X. Seth, say hi.
Hey everyone, welcome back to another episode. We are excited to be back. I know this is our 6-year anniversary of launching the podcast. So Ken and I are excited to be here. There's a few things to run through. First of all, I wanted to give a shout out to our sponsor, Redpoint Security. Redpoint specializes in code security for coders, bolstered by years of experience testing applications and conducting code reviews against all types of apps, including web, mobile, AI, and Web3. Redpoint also offers training to help ground your teams in better security practices across the development lifecycle. So check out redpointsecurity.com for more information and put your company on a path to better security. Thanks to Redpoint for sponsoring our 6-year episode. Outside of that, we do have trainings coming up. KernelCon is the one that's next on the calendar. That's April, 2nd and 3rd are the dates that we will be conducting secure code review at KernelCon. I'll drop the link in here shortly. But we also have been invited to be one of the trainers for DEF CON Paris also in April, right? The later part of April. So if you are in Europe looking for an opportunity to take secure code review, this is going to be your chance. There may be other opportunities coming up this year. We just don't know quite yet from a European perspective. But the Paris training will be a 4-day training as opposed to the regular 2-day, which is going to give us a lot of time to dig in and really do some deep dives into code review principles, patterns, AI, like the use of AI in a code review, how we're actually utilizing that, setting up an environment, other things that we kind of have to gloss over in the 2-day course because there is a lot to cover. But the 4-day course should be, it'll be an interesting experience. Right, Ken? Whoops, I put Reg in there, not the actual training course. That's my bad.
Hey, just short circuit the process. Just go register. That's what Seth said.
Just go into register. Don't even review. Just pick our course. Go register. KernelCon, we love to support it. Ken will also and I will also be at CactusCon. That's next month in Arizona.
Phoenix.
If you will be, in Phoenix. If you will be there, let us know. I'm pretty sure we're going to do a happy hour. We just haven't figured out exactly what the details of that look like. But at the very least, get together with friends, listeners, and talk security, talk AppSec, whatever else. Maybe have a few drinks. That'd be a fun time.
Yeah, actually, I was talking to James this morning about that. So yeah, we're definitely TryRun is definitely into co-sponsor an evening event at CactusCon.
Okay.
So should be a good one.
Hey, Charles. Yeah, it'll be a fun time. Let me think what else. I don't know. I feel like I'm still a little discombobulated trying to get back into the swing of things for the year. I don't know how you feel about that, Ken.
I never left.
You never left. That's right. Yeah.
But it's also why I'm sick right now. It's because apparently you need sleep and stuff like that to exist
regular human things. I don't know what you're talking about. Come on.
Yeah.
You're a startup founder now. You don't need any of that. It's just like you're a bot, right?
Yeah, basically. It's in a good way, though. Yeah. No,
Cool.
Yeah, I think the only thing I was gonna. Oh, sorry. Are you still?
No. Go ahead. Go ahead. Yep. Yeah.
Sweet. So I was gonna mention just a couple things. The first one is just the sweater I'm wearing right now. I bought this from. I'm trying to see if you can see it. AI won't save you. I need to do the mirroring of my thing, and then it'll be easier to tell what it's saying. But in any case, this is a awesome bit of design here from Cloud Security Partners. I'm only mentioning it because you can buy it at any time, and essentially the proceeds go to Toys for Tots. So obviously it'll go for 2024 Toys for Tots. I'll post a link here in a sec. And then they actually, cloud security partners matches whatever you donate. Or so basically, when you buy this, that goes towards that donation, and they match donations. So that was the first thing I was going to mention. Yeah, second thing is a little hoarse today, not feeling super well. So, just bear in mind, I'm not at 100%. Yeah. And I guess the last thing is, since Dry Run does sponsor things, I will mention that although we're in beta, pretty soon I'm about to release a check for doing AppSec analysis on your code through our product. And it takes about 30 seconds to install, and then you can start getting analysis of your code. Right now, we have some other checks you run around. Are you changing sensitive functions? Are you changing sensitive files? Have you touched a file you're not supposed to according to the configuration? We alert the security team on those types of things. We have warnings and annotations. So that's the last thing I'll mention before we just kind of get right into it. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, honestly, like we've been doing some, early year kind of dev stuff on some of our processes, some of our like internal things. It's been interesting to see Dry Run actually flag sensitive functions and like just the way that the process works there. It just seems to be super effective for at least like identifying things that I didn't necessarily configure, but it's doing a pretty good job of flagging the stuff that we should be concerned about. So if we're touching some authentication modules, all of a sudden we get a notification, hey, it looks like this is something interesting, maybe you should take care, right? That kind of stuff. It's cool. It's good stuff.
Thanks. Yeah, the ultimate goal is to really take all of the different checks that run, and we're going to put them together, produce a risk score, tell you whether or not you should care about that PR, or whether you can just go on without your day. That's kind of the goal, right? Is to be the canary in the coal mine kind of thing. Reduce all, and actually that leads to kind of a discussion, because I don't know if we can jump into it about false positives versus false negatives. Is that okay with you?
Cool. Yeah, let's do it.
I got asked last week. I think it was. Wait, today's Tuesday. Yeah, so last week, do people care more about false positives or false negatives? To be honest with you, I didn't really know the answer, because I've heard, I don't know, Seth. I've heard all kinds of different takes on what's more important from a security tools perspective. Like, hey, maybe it's noisy, but as long as it doesn't miss things, or vice versa. Like, no, it's not cool to have tons of false positives. It's a huge burden. But I'm curious. First, two things. First, what are your personal thoughts on false positives versus false negative? And I can cover what Twitter said and what our Slack folks had said as well. But what are your thoughts on that? And then actually, let's just start there. Sorry.
Okay. I have lots of feelings on false positives because I've spent so much of my career combing through false positives. It seems like early days, even like from an automated tool perspective, false positives seems to be a necessary evil, right? Like just based on how our automated systems have run in the past. And so as much as I like dread something like Fortify giving me false positives, it's also to me kind of this security blanket of, okay, at least I know the tool ran, right? I almost use it as a sanity check that the tool is indeed processing code and is doing what I've expected in the past. Now, that doesn't mean that they're super useful over time, right? Like, as I said, like I've spent so much time just like combing through false positives over the years and running down rabbit holes, going on side quests, trying to determine if, something from an automated scanner actually is vulnerable in the way that they've represented. And I would probably say 95% of the time that I've dug into those findings, it hasn't been anything that's been actionable or usable, right? And so, like, I have mixed feelings, right? Like, I would, as someone that's low level in the code, I would rather see false positives to make sure that the tool is running appropriately, and that it's doing what I expect it to do, than to tune them all out and then be afraid that I have a false negative, that the tool is not doing what is intended. But that's because I'm so close to it, right? Like I've operated as a filter to false positives for the security team for the last 15 years, right? And so that's my own, I guess, workload, or pattern that I use. Is That's part of the value that I've always provided, is being able to take those false positives, go through them quickly. What we're starting to use an LLM, what you're starting to do a dry run to actually eliminate, and step into that location. But I feel like they've got to be there for me to actually function and actually have some assurance that the tool is operating properly. I don't know if that's really a great answer for you, but
it is, because so what's funny is when I originally asked this question, my assumption was that, or the way I was thinking about it narrowly, was like essentially developers that have to deal with false positives, or internal security teams that have to deal with false positives. What I hadn't thought too much about were people that make money off of finding vulnerabilities. And so, for instance, Douglas Day, who was a really, really solid, is a really, really solid bug bounty researcher, and gave a lot of great findings to us at GitHub, had responded on Twitter saying, mixed, kind of what you said, mixed feelings. Like, yeah, false positives leads to fatigue, inactionable or inaction, all the same kind of things that you just said. At the same time, also along the same lines, well, maybe a little differently, because he wasn't necessarily validating other people's like scan tool outputs. But if a tool doesn't tell him, about something, then he's like, well, I lose out, right? I don't make money. And that's a pretty, I don't know, that's a pretty interesting take on it, because I really hadn't thought about it in that way, where it's like, yeah, if you're using this to like, but see, I think also the reason I didn't think about that was that with like bug bounty researchers specifically, usually to make the high dollar bit, it's not really a tool based process, right? Except for it kind of can be, right? Like a good example would be you and I talked a lot about GraphQL, right? It's like you can find some really impactful things about GraphQL, but you really, to like iterate through all of, first of all, to infer like what queries and mutations you can run, you need to do a bit of introspection. But from there, that could be like a huge list of queries and mutations. And so then you're stuck with a situation where you have like a lot of work to do, a big surface, and like you obviously need to automate some of that. So it makes sense. It's just, I don't know, my head wasn't there. And so and yeah, Charles said, I never trust tools. Yeah, I agree. Yeah. I think you have to verify and not trust, I guess. But in any case, the second question I was going to ask you, Seth, though, is like, from your client's perspective, right? Or even from other colleagues doing similar work, have you gotten input before on what they think about? I'm certain you have, but I'm curious,
yeah,
assuming you've gotten input on their feeling here, like, what have you heard?
I mean, most of what I get from clients is that a similar sentiment to Charles, right? Like if they're doing any sort of vulnerability management, they've got a vulnerability management program, they don't trust the tools, right? Because the amount of data coming out of it, the amount of false positives, like the signal to noise ratio from a positive to a false positive is so, I can't remember, it's so low, right? Like, so there's so few valid findings in this list that's coming back that they don't trust them. And I've heard this multiple times, because we'll go in and do an assessment, a dynamic, a code review, or validate the findings. And then we present a report to them, and they're like, wow, this is great. Everything in this report is valid and an actual concern and something that we can go fix. right? And I'm like, well, yeah, like that's why you pay us, right? Like, is so you don't have to go spend 4 weeks digging through everything that came out of this tool to determine the 1 to 2 items, because we can do that quickly based on our experience over time. And that's what we're trying to train an LLM, or we're trying to train AI to actually help with, is to speed up that process for us, that pattern analysis that you and I at this point, we're doing it pretty intuitively, right? I know when I open Fortify that there's going to be findings around, checksums and like certain Java findings and other things that, based on past experience, we know that they're not, right? Like, we know that they're not vulnerabilities, or there's such a low possibility that what it's calling out is an issue that we need to go actually resolve. I'm going to just ignore complete classes, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So, and now I've wandered so far, I can't even remember. Oh, clients, like what they're,
Well, you're just saying, like, when
yeah,
you're
I feel
doing
like clients
consulting,
pay us. Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah. They pay us to actually eliminate the false positives and only present them with real vulnerabilities. And so then the concern becomes more of that false negative that, hey, we gave them assurance that we had looked at everything, but I still have to caveat all of my reports with, man, you only gave me 2-3 weeks to look at, 2 million lines of Ruby. You know, you have to take that with a grain of salt. I'm finding this, especially in the Web3 space, that they want this 100% assurance that once you've looked at a smart contract, that it's secure and it's never going to have any problems, right? And I like it. It's become an issue with clients at times that those false negatives are misinterpreted as far as like what you get out of a security audit, because you're never going to catch everything anyway. Yeah.
No, it's funny that the tolerance is less for false positives than false negatives. And in my head, when I was asked this question, I was like, well, surely, like, so like somebody, and here are some of the responses, by the way. I'm going to read these real quick. So, what is worse to you, false negatives or false positives in your tooling? So I mentioned Douglas. He said, false positives cost me time, false negatives cost me money. But this is the point I wanted to make. One of the responses was from Bobby Tables, who we had on the podcast along with Stefan and
yeah, after that Kubernetes audit that they did years ago.
What's her name? Oh, sorry. I'll remember this in a second. But we had all three on, and this was in Vegas, and this was the Kubernetes attack report came out for the CNCF report. Bobby was on that episode, so if you want to go back and see who Bobby is, but he was saying that his ability to parse out that content and weed out false positives pretty quickly, sort of, it seemed like maybe it wasn't, the false positives weren't as big of a deal, and maybe false negatives would be. Juan, who's a longtime viewer of the podcast, false positives are a major resource waster, and unless the false positives can be handled quickly or cheaply. So again, this goes back to the point, like, it seems like if false positives can quickly be eliminated, then maybe the concern becomes prioritized towards false negatives or false negatives. Yeah, man, having a tough time running the struggle bus hard today, if you can't tell. In any case, the show must go on.
But show must go on.
But yeah, I would have thought, honestly, part of me was like, surely false negatives are the biggest issue, right? Because like, if you miss that, but it's funny to hear like that the human tolerance is like there's less tolerance for the human rather than the tool with false negatives. Yeah. It makes sense to a degree if it's something blatant, obvious, and critical, right? I get that. And especially if it was within like the obvious threat model of that application, kind of get that. But also, to your point, and we've talked about this in the course, it's almost impossible to find everything because you're just not given the time. You just aren't given that time, right? You can do the best job ever at like trying to automate things and speed parts of your methodology up. But at the end of the day, you're still a human. And what was the recommendation for amounts of lines of code a human can reasonably do a proper review on from SmartBear? I forget what it was, but it was like
Oh, I think it's like
not more
200.
than,
Yeah, a
yeah.
couple hundred lines per hour. Hold on, I'm gonna look that up again because it's been a while.
I've heard somewhere between like, yeah, a
Yeah,
couple hundred to 500, but no more than that. And to your point, you're talking about sometimes like a million, 2 million, 3 million lines of code. If it's a Ruby app, I mean, that's like 70 billion lines of code at that point. It's too frustrating, but
well, no. Here, I found it, right? Like this is what is code review, right? Like from SmartBear, their recommendation for code review. So this is like multiple people in, right? Crucial insights. Under review should be less than 200, not exceeding 400, right? So inspection rates of less than 300 lines of code per hour result in the best defect detection. 500 is still good, but expect a significant percentage of defects to be missed if lines of code are reviewed faster than that.
yeah. And I mean, that's so again, how do you expect, well, how would the tolerance, again, like obvious within that threat model, easy to like, not easy to find, but it's pretty concrete finding. I could kind of get why, and something that's like just blatant. Yeah, I mean, I could see why someone would be upset. Somebody would be upset about that. But if we're talking about more, I don't know, nuanced things or whatever, it's like you said, and maybe even stuff that falls outside the original threat model of like, because we always say take a risk-based approach, obviously, like look at what the app's doing, who it's doing it for, a bunch of other factors, and then prioritize your review based off of that. So if you're doing that, yeah, you're probably going to have false negatives once in a while.
Yeah.
Anyways, I just thought it was an interesting exploration into people's sort of risk tolerance and
and there was
think of these things.
If you look in the random channel in the AppSec Slack, right? There was a couple other responses in there from what Scott and Talos and even Jerry. Jerry put it pretty succinctly, right? False positive passed on to the remediation teams without validation is one of the easiest ways to get them not to trust a tool. I would even argue not to trust the security team, right? I mean, if you talk to many developers, that's one of their big complaints is just this, hey, the security team sends us all this stuff without context, without a remediation plan. They give me more work and I get 2 hours into it and realize that it's not really an issue. Like they're not going to take you seriously after that, right? Like that was one of the points that I did want to bring up is it can damage relationships very quickly if it's not a real vulnerability, right? I think the general consensus is that false positives is worse depending on the organization that you're in, at least in the discussion that we had in Slack, because just based on the maturity of the organization and how they actually handle false positives and what their vulnerability management program looks like. So we've got a lot of people that are in product security or application security for large organizations. They're dealing with this on a daily basis. They have to walk a fine line on what is actually provided to developers in order to keep that trust and keep that relationship going, because you can't cry wolf every day.
No.
And I know we've had this discussion in the past, but it's
Oh yeah. And it's one that I think every once in a while it's good to kind of to get a gauge on, because technologies change, processes change, and we evolve, and people's opinions change with that. So it's good to get a temperature check on it. I mean, I like what I'm seeing too in some of these responses, like again, security folks sometimes forget that you shouldn't spend $100 to protect a $20 bill. Totally true.
Yeah.
And I like Scott's, I won't mention the vendor tool, but said, yeah, I wonder if anyone who says, but a false negative is worse, has ever personally had to triage the results of insert vendor product scan. Yeah, exactly. It's pretty tedious and time consuming, or can be. But
Yeah, but part of the problem that I have with the tools and false positives, like the number of vulnerabilities that pop out of things like check marks, is this like I run into this with senior management at organizations and clients that I work with. They think that, oh, well, I have a dynamic scanner, I've got a static analyzer, I'm good. I don't necessarily need to do any more like on my that is my application security program, right? Um, Granted, that's a maturity thing. They haven't had, they haven't dealt with it before, but I see this in a lot of organizations that, again, like, oh, well, I'm catching everything that I need to because I'm running these tools, because that's what the vendors are telling them, even though we know from an experience perspective that that's not necessarily the case.
I wanted to touch on something Charles said here in chat. He said, "This is why, as web hackers, web app hackers, we need to apply the make it hurt method, screenshots, and remediation plan. Super important." And I think I just do want to mention the remediation bit there, because we talk about it again. I always say we talk about it in our course, but we do, and we say, like, when you're writing up remediation advice for folks, try to, especially if you can run the app locally. Like that's the best case scenario, because if you can run their app locally, you can actually test out the fixes. But I like to provide, and I know you do too, I like to provide sample code fixes. I think that's the best way to do it, because if you can give people advice on how to write how to fix it, you give them an example. Obviously I've said this a million times, they'll rewrite it, they'll make it better. These are professional developers, but the point is, at least you gave them a starting point. If you give them some generic, like, remediation, like, OWASP says you should output in code your whatever, blah blah blah, it's like, all right, cool, like, that's not helpful, that's not going to get things fixed quickly. Your security, like, if you're on your side where you're a consultant and you hand over your report and you give like pretty succinct, specific remediation advice, that security team should love you, because now you've just given their developers something actionable that, like, means that there's less cognitive load, and then they can go and implement much quicker, and you'll probably see fixes get rolled out quicker, depending on the organization, the developers, and all that stuff. But
yeah,
it should be. So anyways, I like oh yeah, Scott, yeah, no, totally. I know you weren't like dogging out that tool or anything, and I honestly, I don't care one way or the other, and if you do, but I just didn't want to put them on blast. It's a bad look for me. So anyways.
do you want me to? Because it's a
no, it's fine. So we're not throwing shade today.
We're not. What is this? Right?
I don't have the energy for it. Yeah, no.
Ken must be sick. Normally he just like Twitter barrels messages right through that, right? Yeah, I don't know. So, but where you're going with remediation with the screenshots actually feeds into that other article that we wanted to talk about, with the I in LLM stands for intelligence, right? From Daniel. Right? I'm going to post it here because it speaks directly to bug bounty reports, right? Like, and what he is seeing behind the scenes, that people are actually like providing remediation advice, but they're using the LLMs to generate that remediation advice for these bugs. And, he goes through two or three, at least, different reports that he's received. Exhibit A, Exhibit B coming in, and basically the fix did not necessarily, there was no buffer overflow, right? Like, it's basically the vulnerability is, it's almost like the LLM is hallucinating the fix, the vulnerability, and then it's still ending up in the report. And we're starting to spend time on this because things haven't been validated in a proper manner, right? And I know this is a fine line. I know we've talked a lot about bug bounty reports, or LLMs and AI in general and how it should be used. This is probably one of those instances where, yeah, we need to put a little bit more thought into it before we actually generate some of these recommendations based on what an LLM is telling us, right?
If I remember, and I read that article not today, but like maybe a few days ago or whenever I'd first seen it. But the thing I do remember, I think, anyways, was the or the good use case for this. But where it gets flawed is when you have a non native English speaker submitting to or whatever language and just submitting to a program who does not speak the language that you speak. And actually, it's maybe myopic of me, but I actually don't know of any like I know Bugcrowd, I know HackerOne, right? So, but if I'm a non-native English speaker, that's probably one way to use it. Obviously you need to do some translation and make sure that, but I don't think that's the issue. I think the issue is that we're talking about kind of throwing stuff at the wall using AI to generate some content that makes it seem potentially realistic. Basically trying to trick the bounty program, cause a bit of fatigue, get stuff triaged. Maybe you get lucky and something slips through. If that's the case, obviously it's horrible. But what does make me chuckle a little bit is I was thinking about this when I first read that article. Like it's like, because I've heard use cases recently of using AI to detect AI, and it's just the spy. You remember Spy versus Spy with Mad TV? That's
Yeah.
exactly what it reminds me of. Just two LLMs trying to beat each other.
Yeah.
But
Well,
yeah,
and
anyway, so it's going to be interesting. Those platforms probably will have to put detection in for these types of things.
Yeah,
Like filters.
Yeah. They will at some point. And I mean, and we've seen this in some of the other, like some of our other friends talking about AI detectors that have actually been built and how poorly they actually do, right? Like, and we're starting to see that from like, oh, somebody wrote a paper or a presentation. It was detected as being like written by an AI, but only because we took this whole sum and we didn't actually divide it up. And like, if you go to the companies, they have some disclaimer about, well, you really shouldn't use this as your only detection method for AI written whatever, right? Yeah, so it's an interesting problem that we're going to run into. I know, like, yeah, my daughter actually is she's in college. She works in a writing center, and they've been having a lot of discussions with students on what is an appropriate use of something like Chat GPT to actually help you generate content, right?
Mm-hmm.
Is building an outline, building an overall structure, like things that you would anticipate just looking up online, I can see, but actually generating the full, like, this is what you're supposed to be writing is where it starts to fall down, and where we see things like what Daniel was seeing in those reports, right? It's pulling data that isn't necessarily relevant to the current finding. It's hallucinating security issues that may or may not exist. It's misapplying likelihood, exploitation, and other things to the actual impact, right? And if you've ever tried to ask ChatGPT or one of the LLMs to generate a finding for you, that's exactly what you would see. As someone professional in the field is just, yeah, you're kind of right, but not really, right? So
Actually, on that note, I think that brings up another good point. I'll grab the articles here too, but this was another. So like on that note, again, not to like pivot into that because I'll keep it real brief, but I sent you a link and I was doing a little bit of homework trying to see like, how people are using LLMs to do security work. And so on that note, for code remediation advice out of the box, these researchers found, these are like Georgia Tech PhDs, they found that it was like 50% accurate roughly with pretty much all the major, like GPT 3.5, GPT-4, Code Llama. Those are the three major LLMs, if I'm not mistaken, they tested. How they got it to be above around 90% accuracy to this whole like summarization bit is they used in their tests, they used Bandit for Python, right?
Yep.
They ran scans using a deterministic scanner. They got the remediation advice from that scanner. They said, okay, well, now I'm going to pump this over to the LLM along with code that's vulnerable, and give me a summary, a verbal summary of everything that's wrong here, and what you would do to fix it and all that stuff. Then they took the finding, the code, and the verbalized summary, fed that again into an LLM for another iteration, but this time produce code advice that's actually somewhat, or provide accurate code remediation advice. And that's how they got to their 90%. Now they use a bunch of math symbols and church it up, and it's a PhD paper. So what do you expect? But that's essentially what they're doing. They had some other stuff. Their fine tuning capabilities. They're testing like what vulnerable apps or where they got vulnerable code from. Interestingly enough too, they actually had prompts for each CWE that they were running checks for. And the prompts are there to create unit tests that validate the code they're giving remediation advice for will not break. So it's a very interesting, and they have like a proprietary term they're using, they've coined for it. But in any case, it was a pretty interesting way to use a chained LLM situation to summarize things and then produce like much better output. So I'll share the link. I'll find it here in a sec.
Okay. Yep. Yeah. I think that's where it becomes more effective is you start to give the LLM more and more context about what it is that you want it to say, what the advice is, and basically training it at some level. I almost feel like that's editing of something like what Daniel is seeing in the report is, no, this was wrong. Like go in, you need to refine this statement to get the LLM or to get AI to actually do what you want it to do and to spit something out that is more usable. I think we'll learn over time how to actually apply that. Good call though on that actual article.
Yeah, it's interesting. There's so many different use cases. If you just search, for content, there's or for like use cases that people are implementing, there's tons of interesting research going on out there. But since we're 38, almost 38 minutes into it, I did want to pivot on to GitHub's security findings platform they released.
Yeah.
Again, trying to pull up some links here, but all right. Yeah. So I got this link. I'll put this in. This is actually an interesting one because this was ongoing, and I was a part of the early discussions as this was being designed, and I'll explain why this was really cool. And so this is actually one thing I can still talk about and remember a little bit about GitHub. If I could just paste into Slack, I'll figure this out. Anyways, it's so tough. So basically the whole gist of the article. Oh, wrong keyboard. That's why I got too many keyboards and laptops and iPads and shit in front of me. Right. So security findings platform, really cool. The idea is it says something like, what is it, 150 million findings, scaling vulnerability management across, 150 million findings. All right. So I'm going to take you through a real brief journey of what I remember and how it related to the broader. Well, let's do a summary of the article, then we'll talk about sort of why it was interesting and the broader goal there. So basically it talks about, we have tons of services, and services equate to repos, right? Mm-hmm. And those services all have GAS enabled. So, CodeQL and Dependabot and all that fun stuff. Then there's also like other tools. I think they might have mentioned like Wiz and things like that, different security tooling that they may or may not be using still. I don't know if that wasn't in there. Sorry, guys. But anyways, they use a bunch of tools and that's great. But we need to see like the problem really is, all right, what services are really out of SLA, similar to like with Monocle and Chime that we had on the podcast a couple weeks ago. How do we manage that at scale? How do we show which services are like kind of behind and have a worse score and need to do some things? How do we prioritize what matters and what doesn't? And then how does that play into the broader security posture of our application security code at GitHub, right? So now Steph and me and his team built security findings, and they were part of, oh man, it changed a few times. At one point it was like SecOps, but just to be clear, that wasn't like, the AppSec side of things, the ProdSec side of things. So on the ProdSec side of things, I've talked about on the podcast before, our challenges with security reviews, and not just at GitHub, but just in general, how difficult it is when you're moving pretty fast to actually mitigate risk through doing security reviews where someone submits because they met some criteria for submitting. They tell you what they're going to build, or what more likely what they're already building or are about to ship. And then everybody scrambles to kind of like have input, and it splinters out into all these different types of reviews, GRC, AppSec, whatever. Then everybody comes back and says, oh, you're blessed, and it's probably already shipped anyways, but whatever, right? That's a security review. Obviously, lots of problems. As code change, that's actually when, like, you could do the most thorough review, but like the reality is most vulnerabilities that were pretty critical at any place I've ever worked come through like those incremental changes to the code base after it's been reviewed. So like, I don't know how useful it is. It's good for like a minimum kind of like hygiene situation, and maybe getting a heads up if it's early enough to actually go and help design things. But other than that, it's a pretty tedious business at GitHub / Microsoft's scale. So one of the ideas was, well, as you're going through this process, we need to start determining existing risk of services in the service catalog. So meaning like if you're adding a new feature, maybe it's like low hanging, or not low, maybe it's like low risk or whatever, but it's being attached to a service that has a lot of unremediated findings. It's like, all right, well, like that low risk feature is not a low risk feature anymore. In fact, we need to like halt and take some time to figure out what's going on here. But also like, service owners should be accountable for if they're not like remediating things. Like, what's your plan to remediate those things? How do we track how long, it's going to be to remediate those problems, and where your stream of work is to do so. So why I'm saying all this is it's really neat first of all to see them implement security findings, because it was really just an idea with screenshots when I left. So that first of all is a short timeline. I've only been gone from GitHub for 9 or 10 months now.
Yeah.
I think 10 months. So it's not been a long time, and that's incredible progress. But I think the other cooler part is it's about to enable a bunch of capabilities for them to assess real risk throughout the organization, throughout the ecosystem. And then having this will allow them to optimize through technology and, refinement of their processes. Yeah, how they're reducing risk. And I'm really like excited for them about obviously worked there for almost 6 years. I really care about their security. My product runs on GitHub, and I'm a big fanboy of GitHub. So anyways, it's really neat to see all this. What were your thoughts? I've talked a lot. My voice is scratchy. What do you think about all this?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because I do from a client perspective, especially those that we're helping build larger programs, not just doing like single assessments for. This is one of the things that I see most organizations struggling with, is how to get their hands around. I mean, not talking false positives, false negatives or anything, but just like vulnerabilities, and how to get that processed so that everything gets solved in a timely manner according to whatever SLAs are like required for compliance and other reasons, right? And so it's like with Monocle, and Chime, it's interesting to see how those organizations are actually able to take that and make it an actionable process, because I know all of these other clients are struggling with the same thing, right? Like they get vulnerabilities in, they have all these disparate sources. Number one, number two, they don't necessarily know who the owners are. Like, how do they reduce risk? How do they actually prioritize what that list is? When is it that it should be a critical issue that issues a stop in a build so it can actually be resolved? How do you equate that actually all up? And yes, it's great because we already have like the development boards and like Jira and like workflows that already exist, but plugging into into that as another source, as another type of bug that has very, very specific SLAs associated with it, is so difficult when an organization gets above, right? Like as soon as you separate out developers from project managers and everything else, right? It's just like it's fascinating to watch, and I don't see a lot of organizations that have solved this effectively. Right? Yeah.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's interesting to see. It'll be interesting to see how it actually helps from a security perspective over time, right? To see if it actually is as effective as it seems to be. I mean, granted, this is the blog about it, but it'll be, it might be interesting at some point to have somebody on that's actually implementing the process to talk through what other issues have cropped up in using some automated process like this, or automated tool to push that through. Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting step, and like truthfully, it was really well thought. Like Stefan, who wrote the blog and also was kind of the person behind who pushed the security finding. Super. In fact, I need to get him on the podcast. Super sharp person, but also very thorough and very detail oriented, and thinks critically about pros and cons, best way to do things. Definitely one of those people that has a perfect balance, I would say, of speed, but also doing things the right way, quality and quantity, good balance between the two. So, anyways, good job, Stefan and team. That's really, really awesome to see. I'm excited for you all having something like that to manage your vulnerabilities at scale. It's a huge, huge, huge win. And I really can't overstate that enough. So pretty dope. Yeah. Hey, so it's been 6 years, Seth, 6 years on the podcast. One thing I wanted to ask you was for your highlights. Like, what are the things that I know you did not give you time to prepare at all. So it's going to take you a second to think through this. I know, but we've done a lot. We've done everything from, just going through it while I give you time to think. We've done midwinter's nights conferences, right? Which I guess there's been talk of wanting to bring that back. We did midsummer nights conference stuff with again with Stefan, who big shout out to Stefan Edwards, who like pushed a lot of that stuff for us, and all the volunteers and speakers that came on. We tried experimenting with the After Dark episodes, and then we actually kept finding like real vulnerabilities in open source live, and so we cut that out. Since it's so easy apparently to find pretty significant flaws in open source software, and people get mad about it when you do it live. Anyways, so we did that. We've done obviously we've had a ton of guests on. We've done impromptu, so we've done some impromptu videos, but I think some of our being at conferences and doing some of the Absolute AppSec live at various conferences, the most recent one being LastCon, and just generally showing people how to do stuff and all that. Yeah. What are your thoughts?
My thoughts, my highlights, definitely, like the community in and of itself, right? Like every time that we have like we do one of the live, the live talks, the panels, and or like the happy hour this last year, right? At DEF CON, the first time that we had really done something that formal. The amount of people that we had, the amount of guests that showed up that we've had on over the years, it was definitely like oh yeah, like we've, it's really become something bigger than just you or I. And seeing like the topics that pop out, the stuff that people post in Slack, helping each other out without impetus from you and me, is amazing to see, right? Like, I think everyone's struggling with something similar, just in a, slightly different fashion in a different organization. And the support that we get from the community at large has been awesome. So I'd say that I really enjoyed doing like the conferences, especially at the time, right? Like in the middle of the pandemic, as that was going on, being able to have some of those people come on and just boost spirits across the board was awesome to see. Um, Man, I don't know. Like I think you and I get like a fair amount of energy from this sort of interaction. Obviously, you and I know each other very well, so it's a good way for us to catch up. Like, which is how it started, right? Like, is that's just bitching about AppSec, but right, like that's where it started to come from. But including others in that. Um, yeah, I mean, I think that's it for me, right? Like from a highlight perspective, like just who was it that we had on that was a circus performer before they got into security? It was Mirai. It was somebody from Mirai, right? Like what was her name?
Jess.
Jess. Yes. I'm sure I have it up here.
Oh, by the way, it was InfoSec Anon I was thinking of earlier.
Okay. Yeah.
From the Kubernetes report. Sorry.
Yeah.
But yeah, Jess. I don't know. My
Jessica Rosen,
yes.
something like that. Yes. Yeah. That's one of my favorite, like, backstories that we've ever had on was, how she used to be a circus performer and now she's an AppSec. I'm like, that's amazing, right? Like, I don't know how you beat that as far as like a backstory.
Patrick, who we used to work with at the consultancy we don't talk about, he had he was a pyrotechnic. I don't know what you call that. Pyrotechnic engineer, we'll say.
Yeah.
I'm churching it up. I don't actually know what it's called, but that's what he did before he came into AppSec. It was awesome. It was like the coolest interview I've ever given to any, or had it coolest interview where I was the interviewer to like hear that. I actually we talked forever about that because I was like, okay, can we like delve? We're not glossing over your time as a pyrotechnic wizard. Yeah. So that was cool.
Yeah. What about you? What are your highlights? Right, 6 years.
I mean, we had so many friends on that, sort of. I think I've learned a lot from because I come in with some assumptions and then people will bust those up, and I love that. Like one that comes to mind is Dave Ferguson. This was the first time, and I don't remember how long ago Dave Ferguson's episode was on, but it was a while ago. It was before, because like now, sorry, let me finish these thoughts. So at that time, it was not a thing to say, yeah, developer training isn't really like where it's at, right? That was going against the grain because that's when like all the big platforms were coming up. And while I don't necessarily think it, there was a nuanced discussion, right? It wasn't like, well, don't just take that headline and be like, oh, he's saying like that's not. No, it was a nuanced discussion. There's obviously pros and cons to what you're training, how you're training, who you're training, and all that stuff. But I thought it was the first time where someone came in and said, no, like, actually, I don't agree with what everybody else is saying. Turns out he was very, very prescient, very right, very accurate. And that's what we saw 4 years later, or however long it's been since we had his interview. But I do believe it was pre-pandemic. And like I said, at that time, everybody who was in the training platform was like on the rise. And so it was kind of a controversial thing to say. And we've had other guests like that, hard to recall off the top of my head, where they come in and they like make you really think about, all right, here's what the established sort of norms are and what everybody says we should do and blah, blah, blah. And they're like, yeah, no, it actually doesn't work. Like I've actually tried that. It doesn't work. And here's why, So I love that kind of stuff. And then obviously, I feel like, one of the biggest things that's happened through the podcast over the last 6 years is our ability to travel literally all over the world and meet people. Because this is not a big field, right? It's not really supposed to be. I mean, it's a pretty niche skill set. I mean, obviously we'd love to have a lot of people in it, but it is a pretty niche skill set. And you really have to have like the desire to want to do. It's a strange thing that we do if you think about it. Looking at code and finding vulnerabilities, right? Like that's not, and obviously there's more to it than that, but it's not a common desire on people's part. So anyways, being able to connect with those few people out there all over the world who do this and suffer those same pains and nod along probably a lot when we're sitting here saying this sucks or that's great, or, hey, this is actually the real reality of, doing this at scale or in a real shop or whatever it might be, right? it's really cool to have that. I mean, I think the first time that ever hit me was we went to Global AppSec in Tel Aviv,
Mhm.
and I was
Yep.
sitting at a breakfast buffet alone in the morning before we were going to go train people, and I was wearing the Absolute AppSec shirt, and I mean, this actually, I believe, was
Would have been
2019, like spring of
2019. Yeah.
2019. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
So it was only, a couple years old, or like a year and some change old at that point. And they came up as like, "Hey, I love the podcast," or "You can, and it's nice to meet you in person." And I'm like, I'm in a breakfast buffet in some hotel in Tel Aviv, and I'm getting to meet somebody who does AppSec and recognizes the podcast. So it just, anyways, there's been a lot of highlights like that. Really no lowlights, other than maybe like that time we upset some developers with finding vulnerabilities in stuff. But
No,
besides,
and
too crazy.
I'll reiterate that too, right? Like, I think about, again, the people, the community I've met, right? Like, and sadly, you couldn't make that when we did the deep sec training, or when I did the deep sec training, but meeting like Juan over there and hanging out with him and Mateus for, 2 or 3 days as they were in training, and just like, but we met him through the podcast, right? Like,
Yeah.
that
The
sort of
only one I
connection.
haven't ever gone to.
Yeah.
The only one
That's
I
the one
missed.
yeah, that's the one I have to pull up. Exactly. After all the crap I took about some conference that doesn't really exist, and yeah, whatever.
Oh yeah, so everybody knows this guy was sending me beautiful pictures from Vienna of all the like the pretzel he had bought and the beautiful architecture, and yeah, I was like, cool, man. Thanks,
It's an
thanks,
awful
thanks.
place. Awful place. Yeah, yeah. Yeah. We'll get back there. We'll get back there. Anyway. Well, cool. Yeah, I mean, I'm excited. Like, here's to another 6 years as we keep moving along. And yeah, let us know. Join Slack. Um, and we'll yeah, keep the conversation going there, right?
Sure, yeah. And again, I just want to throw out, because we haven't got, I mean, unless I haven't checked my email in a few days, but for Absolute AppSec email. But again, if there are guests you want us to bring on, if there are topics you want discussed, um, if you're interested in having, also, if you like, if there's a speaker who, or somebody who you think should come on, and sometimes people need a nudge. I didn't realize some people get really nervous about coming on here. Actually, found that out actually yesterday. Excuse me, no, last Friday from someone. But anyways, yeah, just let us know. We'll give some gentle nudges. And but yeah, 6 years goes by. AppSec is, obviously we need topics, right? It's always good to
Yeah.
have topics and input from other folks. We're kind of just winging it, guessing what people want to hear. So
Yep.
still struggling with offensive WebAssembly. Yeah. That's
Yeah.
always a fun one.
Yep. Well, yeah, and we should. Yeah, I mean, I think we'll do more like tool demos as well. I know there's some of that's been on the horizon. Just a matter of kind of putting that together. Like, even if it's as simple as like, oh, look, this is how I utilize Burp, right? Like, we're more than happy to actually show some of that off. I've been playing with some of the new GraphQL stuff that's built into Burp nowadays, or some of the extensions that are there, GraphQL Raider and the like. But pairing that anyway, like, I'm going off now. So like, we'll get to that in a future episode. But we really do appreciate the interaction. We appreciate everybody that's in the community. Thanks for being a part of Absolute AppSec. And yeah, here's to another year, right, Ken?
Absolutely.
Okay.
Cool.
All right. Well, good. Yeah, we'll be back next week, and otherwise, I guess we'll see everybody online. Ken, any last minute thoughts?
Sorry. Yeah, one last thing. So again, I love this. I'm going to try and stand up here. AI won't save you, which is ironic coming from me, I'm sure, but more on that later. I mean, I think there's responsible use. But anyways, the design is really awesome. And again, it goes to Toys for Tots now it's going to be for 2024 December. So anyways, the link's in the chat. Yeah, check it out.
Cool. All right. Thanks, everybody. We'll see you soon.
Thank you. Bye.